Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Canon 211. I am your host. My name is Jake Fowler, and I am honored to be with Dr. David Gwynn today. Dr. Gwynn is a reader, but for us Americans, that means associate professor at Royal Holloway, University of London in the UK. Dr. Gwynn, welcome to the program, and good morning.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you.
So we're going to be discussing your article in the winter 2024 issue of Communio, which arrived about a week ago in May 2025. It's very convenient. The people at Communio always keep you guessing on the time frames, But as it happens, here's the issue right here. The Council of Nicaea 1700 years later. I can't remember exactly, but it seems to me the 25th of May is the 1700th anniversary of the opening. Do you know if that's right?
That's our believed date. A lot of the chronology surrounding the original Council of Nicaea is highly debated. But yes, it's as close to a canonical date as we can have.
So there we go. So we're recording this on the 15th. So in about 10 days from now, we will have the day that we'll commemorate as the opening of the first ecumenical council. And to some extent, you could say the most important one. Right, it sort of sets the tone for centuries worth of church's doctrinal development and heretical battles between this group and that group, and just the sort of the way Providence unfolded. But maybe, just maybe, the standard narrative is to be challenged. So, Dr. Gwynn, if you could maybe give us, I'll say the title, and then if you could provide your motivation. Why did you want to write about this particular topic? And then we'll dive right in. So the topic in question, Athanasius, Nicaea, and the quote Arian controversy. So there we go. What's there about this that needs to be said?
And those quote marks are, of course, important. What I would emphasize at the start, I am somewhat of an anomaly within the Communio volume, and indeed the community of scholars working on Athanasius and these debates, in that I am first and foremost a late Roman historian. So my primary interests lie in the evolution of the later Roman Empire through to the collapse of the West, the survival of the East. Christianity, of course, is a crucial part in that process, but my first and greatest interest lay, and still does lie, in how religious belief influences the development of the Roman Empire. So I tend to be slightly less concerned than a number of the other Communio contributors with the significance of the theological, philosophical thought for later Christian debates, although those are, of course, extremely important. I'm primarily interested in how the debates actually unfolded. And the challenge there is, understandably, the traditional narrative creates a fairly simplified model, the model that became dominant over subsequent centuries, with very clearly defined heroes, Athanasius of Alexandria, of course, being perhaps the most important, and equally clear villains, most notably Arius, the man whose name gets given to the so-called Arian controversy.
So that's all right. We're already off to a really good start. You said the so-called Arian controversy. I am so interested in hearing what. I don't want to get too much ahead. So let's just start at the beginning. If you could provide the historical context, and most of my listeners will be vaguely familiar, so feel free to add as much detail and get as deep as you want. But let's go with the historical context, and then maybe things aren't exactly the way we thought they were.
After all, the Council of Nicaea, part of its profound significance, as you've already outlined, the reason it sets so many precedents, is there had not, of course, been a Christian Roman emperor until Constantine makes that famous decision around the time of the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, when he takes Rome. He only reunited the entire Roman Empire, so an empire that spans from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Sahara Desert, out to the Euphrates, up towards the Crimea. All of that territory comes under his sole rule only in late 324. After he defeated his final rival Licinius. It is therefore very striking that inside 8 months of taking over the entire empire, he's managed to call and assemble the greatest single council of Christian bishops, the most representative council, arguably since the Last Supper or the Council of the Apostles in just post-Jesus Jerusalem. There's never been a gathering like this. And one thing, every historical account, every eyewitness account we have of the council talks about its splendor. It was incredible, especially to a generation of bishops who'd lived through the great persecution that had
Yes.
happened, begun in 303, so 20 years earlier. Every single bishop at Nicaea lived through the great persecution.
So
So
what
there's
do
been
you
an
mean? Sorry,
incredible
I don't.
transformation. And that's the
When
key background.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. There's naturally going to be a bit of a lag just because internet's going a little farther. But I just want to ask, what do you mean by splendor?
So
Like
the
the
sheer scale of the Council of Nicaea, Eusebius of Caesarea, who's our greatest single source for the actual council, he's the author of both the famous ecclesiastical history, which is our main source on the first 3 centuries of the church, but also the life of Constantine, the Vita Constantini. And it includes Eusebius's account of the council. Eusebius was there. He is indeed the only bishop at Nicaea to provide a detailed account.
ah,
And he describes the bishops all seated in rows, then standing as the emperor processes before them. He emphasizes the respect the emperor shows to the bishops and Constantine's role in trying to promote harmony in what was clearly a difficult environment. But that splendor is one of the reasons the Council of Nicaea remains remembered as a moment of authority. It was, for anyone there, an unforgettable experience, and that includes Athanasius. Now, Athanasius was a young priest at the time. There's no evidence he said anything at Nicaea. He's not directly involved in the debates. Later centuries will claim he was. But we have Athanasius's own description of Nicaea. He never says he was directly involved, but he
wow.
likewise remembered it. And he's actually one of the last living people to remember
Because
Nicaea
he was so young, right?
because he was
He's
so
what? He's
young.
about 30.
Yeah. So he'll live
Okay.
for another 50 years. He is one of the very last people we know of who was at Nicaea to die.
Hmm. Okay. So we've got the magnificence of Nicaea. We've got the presence of the first, at least putatively Christian emperor. We've got, I think the tradition gives us 318 bishops gathered, plus priests and deacons, and who knows however many other people, maybe imperial officials or whatnot. And so, the council itself is fairly abbreviated, just a couple of weeks, if memory serves. And we have the condemnation of Arius, and we have the some disputes over the date of Easter, some canons, especially. There's an important canon that we won't really have time to cover, but Canon 6 about bishops going here and there, can't do that. Um, and so, all right, post Nicaea, 3 years later, Athanasius becomes bishop, succeeds his own bishop, Alexander, in Alexandria, and now he has a mess on his hands, doesn't he?
I suppose I should just say on Nicaea, there is a volume called the Cambridge Companion to the Council of Nicaea, which includes attempts to reconstruct how the council actually ran, how many people were there. And admittedly,
Great.
I'm saying that partly because I wrote the chapter called Reconstructing the
Yes.
Council with the approximate numbers and how many people we think could be there and what the order of debates was. The great difficulty for Athanasius is that while the Council of Nicaea is successful in its own initial aims, it hasn't actually resolved the greatest problems that Athanasius will inherit. So when he becomes Bishop of Alexandria in 328, Alexandria has in fact two major divisions that are threatening the authority of the bishop.
Hmm.
Now, the Bishop of Alexandria's authority in Egypt is stronger than almost any other regional bishop in the Roman Empire, not least because Alexandria is so much bigger as a city than all the Egyptian towns and villages. But the Egyptian church, therefore, has more of a hierarchical structure than in many other regions of the empire. The problem is there are two major challenges happening simultaneously. One is a schismatic group who've basically begun appointing their own bishops. This is the Melitian schism. It's initially over the authority of Alexandria and also reactions to the Great Persecution. The Council of Nicaea tried to arrange a reconciliation, that the Melitians would be allowed back in, but subordinate to the overall hierarchy of the Alexandrian Church. That seems to have been breaking down already before Athanasius becomes bishop, and he'll continue to clash with the Melitians for the rest of his episcopate.
Mm.
But then you've also got the original debates between Arius and Alexander. The reason I use so-called Arian controversy is these debates will continue across the entire 4th century and beyond, and they go vastly further than anything Arius ever said. He's the spark. He's not the main focus, but he is the spark. This entire theological debate began in Alexandria, when Arius and Alexander have a disagreement, and Alexander eventually expels Arius. So Egypt and Alexandria is the original heart of these debates. And the problem with the decisions reached at the Council of Nicaea is because it was an attempted compromise, the decisions reached don't fully resolve the theological issues at stake. So while Arius is condemned, exactly what will become Christian orthodoxy is very much open for debate, not least because the original Nicene Creed can be interpreted in different ways. And there's no indication at Nicaea they actually tried to impose one way. Actually, Constantine seems to have wanted harmony. So he didn't mind if people were flexible. But it also, the debates are going to carry on. And of course, they're going to dominate the next 45 years for Athanasius. He's going to be bishop for half a century of ongoing controversy, which still won't be finished when he dies. Although by the time he dies, his efforts and the efforts of other people like Hilary of Poitiers and the emerging Cappadocian fathers is going to secure what becomes known as Christian orthodoxy.
Yes, excellent. And then he's got some liturgical matters that the Egyptians, like apparently they weren't doing the Lenten fast the way that some parts of the church were. Not that that's that big a problem, but so he's inheriting a situation in Alexandria that's less than ideal. All right, so let's dive into then sort of the analysis and the chronology of the controversy, because this is the part that when I read your article, I was struck by. Well, there's one thing you said. I won't give it away. I'll let you say it because they're your words. But I was impressed at your ability to sort of take a step back from the traditional narrative and say, okay, yes, this is what the legend, for lack of a better term, tells us, but okay, what really happened? So Dr. Gwynn, what really did happen? How did we get Arianism, and what role did Athanasius have to play in all this?
And I would emphasize two things at the start. One is Arius is a devout, sincere Christian. I do think it's important to understanding the debates that Arius is just as convinced of his understanding of the Christian truth as Athanasius. There are flaws in what Arius believes, particularly by the standards that develop over time. But when Arius was a presbyter in Alexandria, there's a reason he gathered a following. He's concerned with questions that matter. Above all, questions about how you understand the Trinity, how you understand the role of the Son in human salvation. Those aren't minor academic questions. So Arius is himself sincerely concerned. And there is no agreement in the early 4th century on how you should understand the Trinity. The idea that there's a single Christian orthodoxy, there isn't one on these questions. Not least because the kind of questions they're now debating, how to conceive the Trinity, the books of the New Testament, which they haven't fully agreed on yet. So there's still an ongoing debate over just which books are canonical. But one of the obvious points about the 4th century debates, they couldn't be settled by scripture. Or more accurately, they couldn't be settled clearly on one side just by quoting biblical passages. It required interpretation. It requires exegesis. That's what Arius was doing. It's what Athanasius, of course, will be a master of. But these are deep-rooted Christian questions, and they matter not just to bishops, not just to priests like Arius, they matter to everyday Christians. One of the reasons these debates will carry on is because they do matter. And speaking as a historian, this is the argument I have the most often with my historical colleagues, that they treat the theological debates like they only happen for certain theological intellectuals.
Mm.
And you can't understand the 4th century like that. The problem is that because over the course of the 4th century, one particular interpretation won out. There's good reasons for why it won out. It becomes the basis of Trinitarian orthodoxy. But in the process of winning the argument, one of the things Athanasius in particular, and then the people who continued his work did, was very much present a story where there was always one clear truth, and then there was one obvious error. And so the entire story is presented as orthodoxy versus heresy, or Athanasian orthodoxy against Arianism.
Sure.
And the real problem with the phrase Arianism is it doesn't mean any particular theological position. The way Arianism has come to be used is it means any theological position that is not what becomes the orthodox interpretation of Nicaea.
So you're
In other
saying
words, it's a
the
catch-all.
term, yeah, is it anachronistic to say that Arius was an Arian?
And it depends on how you then define Arian. And that's, of course, why I always put it in quote marks. It's
Okay.
not that you shouldn't use it. It's just it's got to be used carefully. Because if you
Okay.
read a modern textbook on, oh, this is the Arian error, it's what Athanasius said his opponents were teaching. The problem is when we don't have that many writings from Arius or other people Athanasius opposes, history gets written by winners.
Yes.
And heretics in particular, their works get destroyed. But what is notable, and this is where I really began my interest in these entire debates, is when you start comparing what Athanasius says about his opponents, the people he calls Arian, and what they actually say, the only thing his opponents actually have in common is they don't like the original Nicene Creed. Their actual interpretations of the Trinity vary widely. Their understandings of salvation vary. Their theological approaches vary. For me, as a historian, reducing them all to one category doesn't explain how the debates evolved. Because
Right.
in fact, the debates are much more complex. And if I had one real point in my article, it is actually, it's because those debates were more complicated that Athanasius' achievement was as great as it was.
So
Actually,
that's,
Athanasius'
yeah.
polemic, for me, simplifies what he did and actually therefore downplays the scale of the achievement because he claims, oh, I represented traditional orthodoxy. He
Right.
didn't. He defined it. And
There it
he had
is.
to do that, define the entire controversy.
That was the second thing. So the first thing is obviously the shock of hearing maybe Arius didn't really say all that stuff. But then the second thing, that was your point, and that's I'm glad you got to that, is this more accurate historical reading makes Athanasius more a hero, not less. It's more impressive, as you say, what he accomplished. And then we can look. So I'm uh, Providence acted through Athanasius in a much more complex uh, manner than simply as if he was taught his catechism as a boy and he just was staunchly defending it against all these people who were taught their catechism as a boy but rejected it. That's too simple, you're saying, right? And I love that. I agree. But that and history does have a tendency to do that because, as you pointed out, it's written by the victors. So we've got what we think is a black and white issue way back when. Turns out when you dive in, not so black and white, but the story that occurs in gray is more glorious, right? Because of what God has done through these men we now call saints. It really made it come alive for me. And so, yeah, I let me stop talking. Let's get back to your erudition here. All right,
Well, I'll
so
just say, I think what you just said is why I was invited to take part, because there is a tendency, even today, to treat history and theology as separate, and that
mhm,
someone approaching a question like me from a historical perspective must therefore be negative about the heroes of the tradition and the way the tradition's formed.
mm,
And there's no question there have been historians writing on Athanasius who are viciously hostile. I've spent most of my career trying to operate in the balance. I don't perhaps venerate Athanasius to the same extent as the mainstream tradition would. I certainly think there are things he distorts, particularly when it comes to his opposition. But he won. And actually, when I began doing my doctoral thesis, which was on Athanasius's polemic and his construction of his opponents, the first thing that my examiners asked me, and one of those examiners was Rowan Williams, at the time Archbishop of Canterbury,
oh,
and it was the most obvious question. Why did Athanasius win? If you're going to approach this from a totally historical analysis, well, the answer is his theology is brilliant. He grasped the essentials of the questions,
mhm,
and his achievement is therefore greater. And that's really what I wanted to emphasize, that the historical approach doesn't have to be regarded as challenging, contradicting the traditional story, but it refines it and it makes it therefore
yeah,
more important for me.
excellent. So Athanasius, he gets into um, he starts off maybe the first, if memory serves, 20 to 25 years of his career as a bishop. I hate to say career, but that's what it is. He's in his episcopacy. He is spending from like 328 to the early 350s, not mentioning any Nicene watchword, not mentioning his own role in the council, which turns out to be not very much, if anything. How do we account for that? What's there significant in that? That from 328 to 350 or so, um, in his battles against the Arians, not a word about the Council of Nicaea.
Yes. And it is one of those striking features, especially because Athanasius is, of course, remembered as the champion of Nicaea. And from the early 350s onwards, that's exactly what he'll be. What I would emphasize, Athanasius never, across a very long and complicated episcopate, significantly altered his conception of the Christian truth. Essentially, he already holds at the beginning of his episcopate the same core theological principles that he'll come to express much more with the Nicene Creed. But
Hmm.
those first 25 years of his episcopate, firstly, they are full of conflict. He's Bishop of Alexandria for 7 years, in which period he faces several attacks until he's exiled in 335 and has to leave Egypt. He gets back 2 years later, gets exiled again inside the next year and a half, won't return for another 7 years. So by the time you get to 350, he's already actually had 2 periods in exile. He'll have 3 more later on. It is a very complex period. And it's partly because of the ongoing theological debates. It's also because of the schisms, the question of authority in
Mhm.
Alexandria, and ongoing rivalries between different bishops. So he is, he's in a very tense situation. But what is notable about those early years, Athanasius' great early theological writings are really concerned to do two things. One is to lay down his key theological principles. These are the works, the Contingentes de Incarnatione, the double treatise, which most scholars, I think, would now agree with Caled Anatolius, among others, and place in the first 5-7 years of his episcopate. Now, these works aren't citing the Nicene Creed. Indeed, no one seems to have regarded the Nicene Creed as an immediately authoritative statement. Athanasius isn't alone. Nobody's talking about it.
Can I stop? Can I stop you? Sorry, do you think that that's because um, there were multiple interpretations? Is that just occurred to me that you can't point back to a creed if we don't all know and agree on what it means?
And it's not clear Nicaea was actually trying to create a creed that everyone should then use.
Hmm.
And it was trying to produce a statement that the bishops at the council could agree on. But there's no indication bishops were then told, go away and use these in your churches. And there are several clauses in that creed that make a lot of the bishops nervous. This is, of course, most famously true of the so-called Nicene watchword, that term homoousios, consubstantial, of one same essence. It's not a biblical term, and that concerns people. It also, at least taken on one level, implies there's almost no difference between Father and Son within the Trinity.
Right.
After all, if they're of one essence, how are they separate? And a lot of Eastern clerics, including Arius, this was their great concern, that the more you emphasize the equality of the Trinity, the less they're individual persons. So no one seems to have particularly liked the wording of the Nicene Creed. But because homoousios was a flexible term, it wasn't biblical, it could be interpreted different ways, it seems to have been a compromise people could accept. But it is noticeable, when Athanasius writes his first doctrinal treatises, he never uses it. When he writes his great attack on Arianism, the three orations against the Arians, homoousios appears exactly once. And these are the other works he's writing. In the case of the orations, it's very late 330s, early 340s. So in those early works, Athanasius's main aims are firstly to define his own conception of the faith, which for Athanasius is above all focused on soteriology. It's about salvation. It's that the Son must be one with the Father, or the mystery of the incarnation and the salvation process can't occur. And that's one thing Athanasius will never deviate from. This is why for him Arius had to be so wrong. Arius wanted to separate the Son from the Father, to make them clearly distinct persons. The Son is still God for Arius, but he's not true God. For Athanasius, you make that distinction, you break the salvation story. That's very clear in those early writings. But he's not using the Nicene Creed to do it, and he's not appealing to Nicaea.
So at what point then does he realize that the creed is of use to his theological project?
And the key point seems to be in the early 350s. One downside with the fact that Athanasius always maintains he's upholding tradition, he never actually explains why he changed on this particular point, because he wants to present it as part of an ongoing process. What a historian would analyze, by the early 350s, Athanasius is in trouble. He's been Bishop of Alexandria now for more than 20 years, but he's still facing challenges in Egypt, but more importantly, in the wider Eastern Greek-speaking church. What's become the dominant orthodoxy isn't the theology of Arius, but it is a theology that Athanasius regards as making the same mistakes. So Athanasius classes everything that separates too far Father and Son as Arian. Even though he knows perfectly well the people he's accusing of being Arian are actively denying Arius. He knows that they're trying to separate themselves. But for Athanasius, they're still making the same error. But they have now become the dominant voice in the Eastern Church by the 350s. The emperor is Constantius II, Constantine's longest surviving son. And Constantius is increasingly putting his weight behind what's usually now known as Homoian theology. So the idea that the Father and Son are like, homoios.
They're just like. We can all agree they're like each other. Yeah.
Exactly. It's so loose, so general, that almost everyone can accept it on some level, but it lets in so many different ideas that for Athanasius, it's unacceptable. And yet, this is what's becoming the dominant faith of the Eastern Church. I would just add, it's at this precise period that the Romans are also sending missions out beyond their borders to the Germanic peoples, notably the Goths. And this is why when the Goths enter the Roman Empire, they get called Arians. because in fact the Goths adopted the form of Christianity that was imperial orthodoxy in the 350s to 360s. Unfortunately for the Goths, that will be heretical by the time you get to the 390s. But for Athanasius, what all this meant in the 350s was he needed something that could be a symbol. He'd tried promoting his own faith. He'd tried trying to define Arianism. That wasn't working in rallying sufficient support. And it does seem that he needed something he could use as a symbol. And at some point in the very early 350s, he identifies that as the Nicene Creed. He realizes that if he can clearly define that creed, define what homoousios was meant to mean, the Nicene Creed would exclude all those alternatives.
So it's my understanding that Arius did not distinguish, as the Cappadocians would, between substance and person as clearly as they did. Is that right?
You said Arius. Did you mean Athanasius?
I meant Athanasius. Yes. Sorry about
And
that.
although actually I suspect the answer is true for both. Yes. We're back with the fact that orthodoxy does in fact evolve over time.
Yes.
Not
Okay.
in the sense necessarily of the actual underlying beliefs, but the language that's used.
Okay.
And one of the great problems they were having, this is what Arius and Alexander are arguing about. It is, of course, a paradox that Christianity is a monotheistic Trinitarian religion. You need to have a way to express the Trinity, but you also are expressing one divinity, and they don't have the language for it. One of Arius's greatest concerns was people who so emphasized the oneness that there weren't really clear distinctions, what's sometimes called modalism, not always an accurate label, but the idea that the Trinity is really just one, not truly three. And yet all Christians are baptized in three.
Right.
But Arius, trying to clear the separation between Father and Son, subordinates the Son so far from the Father that while Arius is still emphasizing the Son is God, it's not clear what that means. And this is the debate that's still ongoing. One reason they use this word homoios, like. So the Father can be like the Son, that means they're separate, but they can also talk about the one divinity. What will eventually become the Cappadocian solution? Three hypostases in one ousia. So three persons in one essence relies on a clear-cut distinction between ousia and hypostasis.
Yes.
The difficulty is, for a lot of early 4th century theologians, those two words are synonyms. They do technically both mean what's lying beneath. And for Athanasius in particular, he does not seem to like talking about multiple hypostases. He tends to use ousia, nature, hypostasis. They're not actual true synonyms, but they're very similar in his writings. He doesn't talk about the three. It's not that Athanasius is denying the three persons. Actually, in theological terms, he's the same as the Cappadocians. They've got the same basic idea.
Sure.
But it's Basil of Caesarea, after Athanasius's death, who will really define it. Athanasius struggled for all his episcopal career with, do you accept people who talk about three hypostases? Because most of the people who'd done that at the time of Nicaea were people he regarded as Arians.
So there is the common, well, maybe it's not common. I shouldn't say common. Um, for those who do go a tad further in their theological studies, people such as myself, we're taught that one of the glories of Athanasius's legacy is that the phenomenon you just sort of described, that we have to get past the terms because sometimes the terms are too fluid and flexible, and we need to get to what people mean when they say this or that term. Is there historical evidence to support that Athanasius did that? Because that's what I was taught, that one of the crowning glories of his career is that he was able to bring people together around this concept that we now would call Nicene orthodoxy, because he could look at people using a variety of ways to describe the Trinity and say, ah, yes, that's what I mean. And you're saying it differently, but that's what that means. And we all mean the same thing. And we're all against those guys. Is there evidence to support that he did that over time?
Yes, there is. And Athanasius does, of course, evolve over time. You can't be a bishop for 45 years, certainly not years this controversial, without evolving over time. And what I suppose the 2 points I'd emphasize: one, Athanasius identified probably better than anyone else in those middle years of the 4th century the importance of thinking about scripture not in terms of here's an individual verse, but in terms of how you are reading the overall scriptural text, what he calls the scope of
Mm.
scripture. Ernest wrote a very good book on the Bible in Athanasius. And he's therefore much clearer on the issues. Not homoousios isn't a scriptural term. What matters is, does it convey the wider meaning of scripture? And so that emphasis helps you get past this issue of what if Proverbs 8:22 uses the word created? Or what if Jesus says, the Father is greater than I? It's not the individual scriptural verse, it's the wider meaning. That's one way to draw people together. The other is to give Athanasius credit, and I think it's real credit, given how long he'd been involved in polemical arguments. He does, over time, come to recognize that there are people using three hypostases language who mean basically what he does. And that isn't an easy step for him to make. After all, he's been involved in really heated debates, which have seen him in and out of exile. So to make this step, most famously, it's particularly in his later years, it's in the 360s. So things like his letter to Antioch, the Thomas and Antiochinos, which is saying, yes, some people talk about one hypostasis, and it's quite clear that's still Athanasius's primary use. Others talk about three. But we all agree on what matters. Likewise, he can recognize that there are people who hate the word homoousios, but who actually have the same basic theology as he does. They're just worried about it not being a scriptural term. So he does, particularly in the 360s, begin building the basis for a consensus. Without the additional work on the definition, he's never going to be able to quite develop that. And in any case, he dies just that bit too early. It's the Cappadocian Fathers who developed this. And Basil's letters to Athanasius are interesting because Basil respects Athanasius greatly. But at the same time, Basil's a product of the next generation. He wants Athanasius to move a bit further to what he'll accept. And so it's an interesting dynamic.
Hmm.
You don't get, in other words, what will eventually become the Orthodox tradition without them all. You
You
don't
mean
get it
all
without
the Greek
Athanasius's
fathers?
long labors, but you need the Cappadocians as well. They're all
I see.
part of the same story.
Okay. So I was just about to ask, I'm glad you brought that up. At what point does the majority of the church recognize the formula of faith as expressed in Nicaea to be the Orthodox understanding?
And it is, of course, very difficult to actually work out across an entire empire-wide church, not least, of course, because you've got a Latin half and a Greek half, and these debates work slightly different in Latin, not least, of course, because notoriously, when they first tried to translate hypostasis and ousia, they got the word substantia for both of them, because you needed actually, once again, to think through the meaning of the words. But very broadly, as Athanasius had a strong following in the West. The West was never as deeply rooted in these debates because they were originally a Greek language debate. And what Arius was most concerned about, this idea of overly unifying the Trinity, wasn't a primary Western concern. Add in the fact that Athanasius spends 10 years across two exiles in the West developing support. By the late 350s, it would seem that most of the Western Church, when put under pressure by the Emperor Constantius II, support Athanasius and therefore are willing to endorse the Nicene Creed. Exactly how they understand that creed isn't clear. Our best Western source for this is Hilary of Poitiers, and Hilary says he never really met the Nicene Creed until later on in his career because it wasn't really part of his Western upbringing.
Hmm.
But the West, therefore, seems to already be there by the late 350s. It's certainly moving in that direction. Doesn't alter the fact there'll still be Western bishops who are promoting what Athanasius would call Arian positions, most famously Auxentius of Milan. That's the man Ambrose will replace and cause a lot of the tensions in Milan in the 370s as a result. In the East, the dominant theology of the 350s seems to be based around this Homoian formula.
Hmm.
Constantius II dies in 361. He's replaced by the last pagan to rule the empire, Julian the Apostate. Julian, of course, therefore has no interest in these debates. Indeed, Julian ordered all Christian exiles to come back because he thought it would weaken the Christian church. He was right there, that if he lets every person who's ever been exiled back in, it'll cause chaos within the church.
Sure.
It is interesting that Julian then promptly made one exception to his rule that exiles could come back and sent Athanasius back into exile. Athanasius was in fact exiled by every emperor who met him, with only one exception, the short-lived emperor Jovian.
We
But
have a saying in the US about that. If you meet a bunch of people and everybody's a jerk, maybe you're the jerk.
so Julian dies in a failed attack on Persia. His replacement Jovian is the only emperor between Constantine and Theodosius I to actually support Nicaea, and he died inside 8 months. His successor in the East, an emperor named Valens, is another Homoian. So it's still true, therefore, into the 360s and indeed the early 370s in the East that the imperial position on orthodoxy is promoting Homoian teachings.
And just to be
Whereas,
clear, this is an attempt at compromise, right?
exactly,
So
it's a
we're
sincere
striving,
Christian position.
yeah, we're striving for unity. And I've never taught at your level, Dr. Gwynn, but I have taught this to some younger kids before, middle schoolers. And I would make it a point to say the emperor's primary concern is imperial unity. And he's not primarily concerned, maybe until Justinian, he's not primarily concerned with what's theologically correct. He wants everybody to get along for the sake of the health and welfare of the empire, because that was the Roman heritage. We're inheriting a situation where if we're not pleasing the gods, then the gods will send us destruction. And when it shifts to the one true God, well, if we're not pleasing that one, it's going to cause our destruction. So we need everybody to get along. We need just homoios. That's the way to say it. And so, that perhaps accounts for, I don't want to excuse the emperors so lightly, because they did end up to be heretical, even materially, let's say. But it's not as if they're seeking to counter orthodoxy for what it is. They're instead looking to promote that unity that I spoke of a moment ago.
Yes, and the one thing I would add, because this is what I always end up trying to get across to my history students, is everything you just said is entirely correct, and that belief in unity is itself a sincere religious position. These people are not trying to use Christianity like some modern atheistic or Enlightenment ruler. Constantius is a devout Christian, so is Valens. And so they are actively promoting their vision of the Christian faith. But certainly by the 370s, there's a growing strength within the Eastern Church of people who are rallying around Nicaea. Now, Athanasius will die in 373. The true change came about not least because Valens was killed. He's killed in 378 when the Goths move into the Balkan territories across the Danube. He's killed at Adrianople. His successor in the East is actually a Spaniard from the West named Theodosius. And Theodosius is a devout believer in Nicaea. But it's also true that Theodosius may well have recognized that so by this point, by 378, is probably the majority of the Eastern Church. That this movement has indeed spread through Athanasius, through the Cappadocians. So what Theodosius can do, once he's tried to stabilize the situation with the Goths, is summon another major council. Not on the same scale as Nicaea, but this is what will become known as the Second Ecumenical Council, the Council of Constantinople in 381. And what it can do is look at the original Nicene Creed and alter its wording, particularly to insert the Holy Spirit, who famously gets a very short reference in the original Creed and in the
We,
Holy
yeah,
Spirit,
we recognize the Holy Spirit.
but
We
also,
acknowledge.
to clarify what homoousios means
Hmm.
and declare that this is now what's expected to be the mainstream position of the church. And Theodosius actually passes a law in 380, so just before the council,
Hmm.
saying that we are now going to legally state. How do you know what orthodoxy is? Well, it's what Peter of Alexandria says. It's what Damasus of Rome says. And it centers on the Nicene Creed.
Got it.
So by that point, you've got that victory. Athanasius hasn't quite lived to see it.
Just about a decade shy, which is a shame, but that's the way God would have it. Let's double back just a bit. In your article, you note that what we generally refer to as Arianism should more accurately be described as Athanasian Arianism. Could you speak a little bit about that?
And the great problem we once again have, very little survives from Arius himself, only a couple of letters. Very little survives from most of the people who Athanasius disagreed with, except creedal statements.
Hmm.
Now, what Athanasius did, most notably in the work the De Synodis, was to pull all of those different statements together, line them up, and claim that this is one heresy. This is the Arian heresy. They just keep changing what they mean. When in fact, what he's actually demonstrated is just how diverse the Eastern viewpoints were in how they were trying to express the relationship between father and son.
Hmm.
And I therefore find it a treasure trove of documentary information. But the side effect of this, and side effect's perhaps the wrong expression because Athanasius meant it, is Athanasius has built one specific image of this is what Arians believe.
Hmm.
In the article, I gave a summary of it, which is actually Athanasius's own summary from the First Oration against the Arians. And the problem is, once you line up all the statements that Athanasius claims make up the Arian heresy, there isn't a single person we know of in the 4th century who held them all. So if we use Athanasius's definition of what it is to be Arian, Arius is not an Arian. Because not everything Athanasius claims are things Arius says, nor are the people he's arguing with in the 350s or indeed the 360s. It's a very effective device that Athanasius has used. Basically, it's pulling all your enemies together so you
Sure.
can put them under one label. Speaking as a historian, what it distorts is how the debate actually flows. That you have so
Right.
many different views. They're not all the same, except that they all share the view that they're trying to find a better statement than the original Nicene Creed.
So I was taught, and Dr. Stephen Hildebrand, are you familiar with his work? Steve is he's a mentor, and I'm blessed to call him a friend. And so, I learned most of all this from him in the courses that he gave on Christology at Franciscan University. And I remember distinctly because he used a vivid example that, in fact, I still use with my own children about Athanasius, his ability to see through, or see his opponent's arguments through to their logical conclusions, maybe perhaps conclusions they themselves did not see. Do you think that for one, is that accurate? And for two, how much did that play a role? If it's accurate, how much did that play a role in this distilling of all the variety of Arian views into this sort of one brief? I mean, it's less than a paragraph the way you've got it described here. Dr. Hildebrand, if I remember right, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, he says, well, this is because Athanasius can see where this theology is leading, and he's anticipating their conclusions, and he sees it better than they do, right? And not least because, as we now, we look back and say, well, Athanasius had the Holy Spirit moving, amongst him. Oh, we have a special guest commentator. So we'll have two people now listening, Dr. Gwynn. If you could speak to that. Oh, Mary Therese, over here, babe. I'll put
But to
myself
answer
on
the
mute. And yes, and this is an indication we're nearing our time window. Yeah. All right. Okay.
but
So,
yes, to
um,
answer the original question, I agree with Steve. I do think this is part of Athanasius' real theological gift. He had a better sense of what the real underlying issues were, and therefore where conclusions would lead. Where I suppose I struggle is he does then impose those views on people who never said them and almost certainly wouldn't have shared that this is where their views must lead. But it is indeed true. One of Athanasius' most common expressions in the orations against the Arians is "it is necessary." If you say this, then it is necessary that you think X. So Athanasius repeatedly claims that Arius and the Arians make the Son changeable. Well, everything we've got that they say denies that. Arius only ever says the Son is unchangeable. But what Athanasius is arguing is if you separated the Son from the Father as far as you have, then by nature the Son will end up changeable, whether you meant that or not. So it's an entirely logical conclusion drawn. My problem is that it's Athanasius's vision that then got imposed on the people he's attacking. And to assume that that is what they must have believed, that for me historically isn't the valid approach, because it's rejecting what these people actually said in favor of what Athanasius drew from them. Yet I would certainly agree that Athanasius has identified where the debate will lead, and therefore he's worked out which principles you must fight to defend.
okay, very well. So we could say, on the one hand, he's theologically accurate to the detriment of an accurate historical record. And if were he to be a little more historically accurate, it would just take that much longer to do all of the theology.
Yes,
Decades.
I mean,
And he didn't have decades.
being fair to his opponents is not part of his aim. It's
Sure.
not indeed something he'd conceive of. His role is to highlight these are the dangers, and this is why you must uphold what he believes to be orthodoxy. He's not a historian, after all.
Sure. And so that makes his achievement all the more glorious because, as you said at the outset, and I'll say again now, it isn't as if, as a schoolboy, he was handed the creed and said, "Here you go, defend that with your life." He is, by the grace of God, helping flesh out and sort of hammer out the proper way to understand the relationship of the Son to the Father, and then with the assistance of Basil and the Gregories, the church finally arrives at, oh, this is what these words mean in the scriptures. Thank you, Jesus. We could praise you more, Lord, because, okay, excellent.
And if I could just add one thing, because it's actually where my article ends. But for me, one of the traps with the way the tradition remembers Athanasius is they focus too much on the theological treatises. Those are indeed important. But if there's one block of Athanasius' writings that the tradition has undervalued, it's the festal letters. It's the
Mm,
letters that he wrote for every Easter. They're the only pastoral statements from Athanasius we have. They're the closest we've got to his sermons. And if you read those letters, you don't find these theological debates about Arianism. It's barely mentioned. What you do get is why these debates matter to ordinary Christians. This is why you should be trying to live your life by these principles. This is why defending salvation through the Son is essential. And I certainly made that mistake when I started, that the festal letters were just, you found them in an appendix at the end. You didn't really
sure,
look at them.
sure.
Now, thanks to David Bracke at Ohio, he and I produced the festal letters in a full English translation for the first time a couple of years back. The translation's entirely by David Bracke because the festal letters survived in Syriac and Coptic, not in Greek.
Ah,
But if there is one thing I would urge anyone who wants to understand why Athanasius thought these issues mattered so much, why they were so crucial to an ordinary Christian, and to actually understand why Athanasius succeeded, is because he realized all this, I'd read his festal letters.
absolutely. I will search for those texts, that one you mentioned, and the Cambridge Companion. that you have some contribution in, and I will post them in the description or the notes to this episode of the podcast. I think we probably should wrap it up. This one is not going to get any easier to handle. Dr. Gwynn, thank you so much. Yeah, she is reminding me. That's why I was on mute. One last question. Aside from the works that you have authored, I like to ask my guests, what do you suggest people to read? Can you give me one suggestion for what should my audience read to better themselves, theologically, historically, both?
And if we're thinking Athanasius theology, Caled Anatolius. Athanasius, the coherence of his thought. It's the best book on Athanasius theology I've ever read. He's also,
Excellent.
of course, the contributor to Communio.
In the
On
same
the
article
ascetics,
edition, yeah. There.
yeah. And on the ascetic side, David Brachi's book, Athanasius
Okay.
and the Politics of Asceticism. The title's slightly misleading. It's much more about the ascetic teachings and how they're so important to Athanasius. But
Excellent.
those are the two. And
Excellent.
certainly have most influenced me in just trying to look beyond what, I began from a fairly narrow historical question of, is Athanasius a good historical source? And I'm still not sure I know the perfect answer to that, but it's been worth working on him for 20 years just to try and draw out all the implications.
All right. Thank you so much once again. And with that, ladies and gents, we have to conclude. I wish I was raising a glass of whiskey, but it's too early for that, even for me. Water, coffee. We will both, Dr. Gwynn and I will remind each and every one of you to never give up, to keep on smiling, and to remember one day you will die. Cheers.